The desert stretched out like a sea of copper and rust beneath the late afternoon sun, endless and indifferent. The land here in southern Arizona territory was hard country, the kind that made men either stronger or buried them without ceremony. The saguaro cacti stood like sentinels along the rocky slopes, their arms raised in what might have been surrender or warning, depending on how a man chose to see it. The air shimmered with heat, even as the day began its slow descent toward evening, and the wind carried nothing but dust and the faint promise of a coolness that would not arrive for hours yet. The town of Mineral Springs sat low in a basin between two ranges of rust-colored hills, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to emerge from the earth itself rather than having been built upon it. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot from one end of town to the other, flanked by false-fronted structures that cast long shadows in the slanting light. The Copper Bell Saloon anchored one end of the street. Its painted sign faded to the color of old bone. The Territorial Marshal's office occupied a squat adobe building near the center, its walls thick enough to keep the heat at bay during the day and hold warmth through the cold desert nights. Deputy Marshal Cole Brennan stood on the covered boardwalk outside the office, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. He was a lean man in his early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and pale eyes that seemed to hold the color of winter ice, even in this furnace of a landscape. He wore his gun low on his right hip, the holster tied down with rawhide, though most who knew him said he had never drawn it in anger. He had been wearing the deputy's star for 3 years now, ever since Marshal Thomas Whitmore had pinned it on him and told him he had the temperament for the work. Brennan was not entirely certain what Whitmore had meant by that, but he had taken the badge and worn it faithfully. The stage from Tucson was late. It should have arrived before noon, and now the sun was beginning its long fall toward the western horizon. Brennan lit his cigarette and watched the empty road that led into town from the east. The stage ran on schedule, with a reliability that bordered on the sacred in this part of the territory. Mail, passengers, news from the wider world, all of it came through on that coach, and when it failed to appear, people noticed. Already he had fielded questions from half a dozen townspeople, each wanting to know where the stage was, whether there had been trouble, whether the Apaches were moving again. Brennan had no answers to give them. He had sent a rider out 2 hours ago to backtrack the route, a young Mexican hand named Esteban who knew the country and could move fast. The kid had not yet returned, and that absence had begun to form a cold knot in Brennan's gut. In this country, silence often meant something had gone wrong, the kind of wrong that left men face down in the arroyos with buzzards circling overhead. The stage out of Tucson was supposed to be carrying 4 prisoners. Brennan knew this because the territorial authorities had sent word 3 days prior. 4 men convicted of various crimes, all bound for the territorial prison at Yuma. The manifest had listed their names and offenses in the efficient language of bureaucracy. Samuel Deacon, convicted of armed robbery and assault. Jacob Farris, horse theft. William Cross, murder during the commission of a felony, and Thomas Lee Pike, multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The message had noted that the prisoners would be under armed guard, 2 deputies riding escort, and that the stage would pass through Mineral Springs on its way west. A routine transfer, the kind that happened a dozen times a year. Except the stage had not arrived, and now the light was changing, and the shadows were growing long, and Brennan could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on the town like a hand against the back of the neck. Marshal Whitmore emerged from the office, a bear of a man with a grey-shot beard and eyes that had seen more than their share of trouble. He moved slowly, favoring his left leg, where a bullet had shattered the bone 5 years back during a shootout with cattle rustlers. The leg had healed poorly, leaving him with a limp that grew more pronounced when the weather turned cold, or when he was worried about something. He was limping now. "Anything?" Whitmore asked, his voice a low rumble. Brennan shook his head. "No sign of Esteban. No sign of the stage." Whitmore pulled at his beard, a gesture Brennan had come to recognize as a sign of deep thought or deeper concern. Could be a broken axle, could be a lame horse, could be they had to hole up somewhere to avoid a dust storm. Could be, Brennan agreed, though neither man believed it. Or it could be something else, Whitmore said quietly. The unspoken possibilities hung between them. Bandits, though the route was not known for such trouble. Apaches, though the tribes in this region had been quiet for months. An accident, a rock slide, a flash flood in one of the dry washes, or something stranger, something that neither man wanted to voice aloud. 4 prisoners under armed guard did not simply vanish. Whitmore sighed and turned back toward the office. I will get a posse together. Soon as Esteban gets back, we will ride out. If we leave before full dark, we can cover some ground before we lose the light entirely. Brennan nodded, flicking the remains of his cigarette into the dust of the street. He felt a restlessness building in his chest. The kind that came before trouble showed its face. He had felt it before, usually in the moments before violence erupted or secrets came spilling out into the open. It was a sense that the world was about to tip sideways, that the careful order of things was about to come undone. The town of Mineral Springs had earned its name from the hot springs that bubbled up from the rocks a mile north of the settlement. The water came from deep in the earth, heated by forces no one fully understood, and it carried with it a faint mineral tang that some claimed had healing properties. The springs had drawn the first settlers, and the discovery of silver in the nearby hills had kept them there. The mines were mostly played out now, but enough ore still came from the shafts to sustain the town and give it a reason to exist beyond mere stubbornness. The population numbered around 300 souls, a mix of miners, ranchers, merchants, and the various hangers-on that such places attracted. There was a general store run by a widow named Constance Merrick, a woman with a sharp eye for numbers and a sharper tongue for those who tried to cheat her. There was a blacksmith named Horace Gann, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a gentle manner that belied his size. There was a doctor, Amos Carr, who had come west after the war and never spoke of what he had seen in the field hospitals. And there was the saloon, run by a former gambler named Silas Quinn, who poured whiskey with a steady hand and kept a shotgun under the bar for those rare occasions when steady hands were not enough. It was a town like 100 others scattered across the territory, clinging to existence in a land that offered little mercy and less comfort. The people here were accustomed to hardship, to long silences and empty horizons, to the knowledge that help was often days away and that a man had to rely on himself and his neighbors if he wanted to survive. But they were not accustomed to mysteries. As the afternoon bled into evening, word of the missing stage spread through Mineral Springs like water soaking into parched ground. Conversations in the saloon turned to speculation. Women gathering water from the communal well exchanged worried glances. The storekeeper stood in her doorway and watched the eastern road with a hand shading her eyes. Esteban returned just as the sun touched the tops of the western hills, his horse lathered and blowing hard. He rode straight to the marshal's office and dismounted in a cloud of dust, his face grim beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Nothing," he reported, breathing hard. "I rode 8 miles out. No sign of the stage, no tracks leaving the road, nothing." Whitmore and Brennan exchanged a look. "You certain?" Whitmore asked. "Sigh, Marshal. I checked every turn-off, every wash. The road is empty. It is like the stage never came this way at all." Which was impossible. The stage had to have left Tucson. The territorial office would have sent word if the departure had been delayed or cancelled. That meant the coach was somewhere between Tucson and Mineral Springs, a stretch of roughly 40 miles of rough country, and it had seemingly vanished without leaving so much as a wheel rut to mark its passage. Whitmore assembled his posse as the light faded from the sky. 6 men, all of them experienced riders, all of them armed and sober. Brennan would ride with them, along with Esteban and 4 others, 2 ranch hands from the Bar 7 outfit, a prospector named Langley who knew the backcountry like the lines on his own palm, and a half-breed tracker called Fox, who rarely spoke but could read sign better than any man Brennan had ever known. They rode out under a sky, turning the color of old blood, the horses moving at a steady trot eastward along the road. The desert around them was settling into its evening transformation, the harsh light softening into shades of purple and amber. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, its voice high and lonesome. They rode in silence, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the jingle of bits and spurs, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth. Brennan kept his eyes on the road ahead, watching for anything out of place, any sign that something had happened here. The miles passed beneath them. The stars began to emerge overhead, brilliant and cold in the vast dome of the sky. A three-quarter moon rose in the east, casting enough light to see by, turning the landscape into a study of silver and shadow. They found the first sign 12 miles out from Mineral Springs. Fox raised a hand, and the group came to a halt. The tracker dismounted and crouched at the side of the road, running his fingers over the ground. Brennan swung down from his saddle and joined him, Whitmore and the others gathering close. "Here," Fox said, pointing. Brennan looked. In the moonlight, he could just make out the marks, deep gouges in the hardpan where something heavy had been dragged off the road. Wheel ruts, definitely, but not following the path they should. Instead, they veered sharply to the left, down into a shallow ravine choked with mesquite and creosote bush. "Stage went off the road," Whitmore said, stating the obvious. "Or was taken off the road," Brennan added quietly. They followed the trail on foot, leading their horses, moving carefully down the slope. The ravine was perhaps 20 feet deep, its bottom sandy and soft. The tracks were clearer here, the story written in pressed earth and disturbed vegetation. And then they found it. The stagecoach lay on its side at the bottom of the ravine, half hidden by a tangle of brush. One wheel had been shattered, the spokes jutting out like broken bones. The door hung open, sagging on its hinges. The luggage boot had been rifled through, its contents scattered across the sand. But there were no horses, no bodies, no sign of the prisoners or their guards. The posse spread out, searching the immediate area by moonlight. Brennan moved around the overturned coach, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The interior of the coach was empty, the seats torn and stained with something dark that might have been blood. Shackles lay on the floor, still locked, but with no wrists inside them. "Marshal!" one of the ranch hands called. "Over here!" They gathered where the man stood, looking down at the sand. Footprints, many of them, leading away from the coach. Some were the prints of boots, others of bare feet or moccasins. The tracks headed west, deeper into the ravine, toward a series of low hills barely visible in the darkness. "How many?" Whitmore asked. Fox studied the ground, his face impassive. 8, maybe 10. Hard to say for certain. Some of the tracks overlap. And the horses? "Taken, led away, not running free. You can see where they were gathered here, then moved out together." Brennan felt the cold knot in his gut tighten. This was no accident. The stage had not simply run off the road. It had been ambushed, its passengers taken, its team stolen. But by whom and for what purpose remained a mystery wrapped in the desert darkness. They searched until the moon reached its zenith, but found nothing more. No bodies, no weapons, no clear indication of what had happened to the 4 prisoners and their guards. Just the abandoned coach, the scattered tracks, and the silence of the surrounding hills. As they prepared to ride back to Mineral Springs and return with proper light, Brennan noticed something. A piece of paper wedged between 2 rocks near the overturned coach. He retrieved it carefully, unfolding it to reveal writing in a careful, educated hand. The words were brief, written in pencil on what appeared to be a page torn from a journal. "They are not who you think they are. The truth is buried at Copper Creek. Trust no one." There was no signature, no date, nothing to indicate who had written it or when. Brennan showed the note to Whitmore, who read it by moonlight, his face unreadable. "Copper Creek," the marshal said slowly. That is old mining country. Been abandoned for 2 years, maybe more. You know it? Some. About 15 miles northwest of here, up in the hill country. Nothing there now but empty shafts and collapsed buildings. Brennan folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. His mind was already working through the possibilities, none of them good. 4 prisoners, supposedly being transported to Yuma. An ambush or an escape, the distinction unclear. And now this cryptic message, suggesting that something deeper was at play, that the official story was not the whole truth. The posse mounted up and began the ride back to Mineral Springs. The night had grown cold, the temperature dropping as it always did in the desert after sundown. Brennan pulled his coat tighter and watched the stars wheel overhead, ancient and indifferent. By the time they reached town, it was well past midnight. Most of the buildings were dark, only a few lamps still burning in windows where people waited for news. Whitmore dismissed the posse with thanks and instructions to be ready to ride out again at first light. The men dispersed to their homes and bunks, leaving Brennan and the marshal standing alone in the street. "What do you make of it?" Whitmore asked. Brennan was silent for a moment, choosing his words. "I think we are not dealing with a simple escape or a robbery. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this happen. And that note suggests there is more to these prisoners than what we were told." "You think the territorial authorities lied to us?" "I think maybe they did not know the whole truth themselves." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Get some rest. We will ride out to Copper Creek in the morning, see what is waiting for us there." But as Brennan made his way to the small room he rented above the general store, he knew that rest would not come easily. His mind turned over the events of the night, the pieces that did not quite fit together, 4 prisoners under guard, a stage that vanished without a trace, an ambush or an inside job, and a mysterious note that suggested conspiracies and buried truths. He lit the lamp in his room and sat on the edge of his narrow bed, pulling the note from his pocket and reading it again. The handwriting was steady, the words precise. This was not the work of an illiterate outlaw or a panicked victim. Someone had taken the time to write this message and leave it where it would be found. Someone who knew they would come looking. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending dust devils spinning through the empty street. Brennan extinguished the lamp and lay back in the darkness, his revolver on the table beside him, listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere out there in the vast desert, 4 men were missing. 2 guards, whose fate remained unknown, and 4 prisoners, whose crimes might be the least of what they had done. "The truth is buried at Copper Creek," the note had said. And in the morning they would ride out to dig it up, whatever it was, whatever waited for them in those abandoned hills. Brennan closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the darkness behind his eyelids was filled with images of overturned coaches and empty shackles and footprints leading away into the unknown. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it answers or more questions. In this country, in this life, a man could never be certain which it would be. All he could do was saddle his horse and ride toward whatever lay ahead, trusting in his wits and his gun, and the thin hope that justice still meant something out here on the edge of civilization. The wind howled outside, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that might never fall, and in the darkness of his small room, Cole Brennan waited for the morning and whatever it would bring. Part 2. The Silence and the Hunt. The first light came cold and blue over the eastern ranges, spreading across the desert floor like water seeking its level. Brennan was already awake, dressed and checking his saddle rigging when the sun broke free of the horizon. He had not slept, not truly, only drifted through those shallow waters between waking and rest, where thoughts circle endlessly without resolution. The town stirred slowly around him. Smoke began to rise from chimneys as breakfast fires were lit. A rooster crowed from somewhere behind the livery. The sound of it seemed too ordinary, too mundane for what the day might hold. Marshal Whitmore was waiting outside the office, along with the same 6 men who had ridden out the night before. They looked tired but determined, faces set with the kind of resolve that came from knowing there was work to be done and no one else to do it. Fox stood apart from the others, checking the hooves of his paint horse with methodical attention. Esteban was rolling a cigarette, his young face somber in the early light. They rode out without ceremony, heading northwest toward the hill country, where Copper Creek waited among the abandoned mines and ghost camps. The morning was still cool, the heat of the day not yet gathered, and the horses moved with fresh energy after a night of rest and grain. The land rose gradually as they left the basin behind, climbing through ridges of broken rock and slopes dotted with juniper and pinon. The vegetation grew denser here, fed by springs that seeped from the higher elevations. In places, the trail narrowed to little more than a game path, forcing them to ride single file through passages where the rock walls pressed close on either side. Brennan rode near the front, behind Fox, who led them with the quiet confidence of a man reading a map written in stone and shadow. The tracker never hesitated, never paused to reconsider, simply moved forward as if following a route he had traveled 1,000 times before. They reached Copper Creek just before noon. The camp lay in a narrow valley between two ridges, sheltered from the worst of the wind, but shadowed for much of the day by the surrounding heights. A dozen structures remained, most of them little more than collapsed frameworks and scattered timbers. The mine entrances were visible as dark mouths in the hillside, 3 of them that Brennan could see, their openings shored with rotting beams. A creek did indeed run through the center of the valley, a thin trickle of water that seemed too modest to have given the place its name. They approached cautiously, spreading out, hands near their weapons. But the camp was empty, silent, except for the whisper of wind through the ruins and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Whitmore dismounted and walked slowly through what had once been the main street of the camp. Brennan followed, his boots crunching on debris and broken glass. The buildings showed signs of having been abandoned in haste years ago. Personal effects lay scattered and rotting, a child's doll with its face worn away by weather, a broken chair, a rusted cookpot. Whatever had driven the miners away had made them leave quickly and never return. "Split up," Whitmore ordered. "Search every structure, every mine entrance. Look for any sign that someone has been here recently." The men fanned out across the camp. Brennan took the eastern section, moving through the skeletal remains of what might have been a bunkhouse. The roof had collapsed inward, leaving only the 4 walls standing like a roofless box open to the sky. Inside, he found more debris, rotted bedding, empty bottles, a deck of cards so water-damaged that the suits were no longer visible. Nothing that suggested anyone had been here in months or years. He moved on to the next structure, then the next, finding only abandonment and decay. The sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, and the heat began to gather in the narrow valley. It was one of the ranch hands who found it. The man called out from near the largest mine entrance, his voice carrying across the camp with an urgency that brought everyone running. Brennan reached him within seconds, Whitmore not far behind despite his bad leg. The ranch hand was standing just inside the mine entrance, holding a piece of cloth. Even in the dim light, Brennan could see it was recent, not weathered or faded like everything else in this place. A strip of dark wool, torn from a larger garment, with a brass button still attached. "There's more," the ranch hand said, pointing deeper into the tunnel. They lit torches, 4 of them, the flames casting wild shadows on the rough-cut walls. The mine shaft ran straight for perhaps 50 feet before branching into multiple passages. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth and standing water. Fox took the lead again, moving slowly, his eyes on the floor of the tunnel. After a moment he crouched and beckoned them closer. In the light of the torches, they could see what he had found. Footprints in the dust, many of them, all recent. The prints led deeper into the mine, following the main passage. They advanced carefully, the torchlight pushing back the darkness only a few feet at a time. The walls were marked here and there with the scars of tools, the ceiling supported by wooden beams that creaked and groaned with the weight of the mountain above. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a slow and steady rhythm, like a clock counting down to nothing. The passage opened into a wider chamber, perhaps 20 feet across. Someone had made camp here. The evidence was unmistakable. A fire pit in the center, cold now but with ashes that were still relatively fresh. Bedrolls laid out against the far wall, empty food tins stacked in a corner, and shackles, 4 sets of them, lying discarded near the fire pit with their chains cut through. But no people, no sign of where they had gone. Whitmore picked up one of the bedrolls and examined it carefully. They were here. The prisoners, maybe the guards too. But when and for how long? Fox was studying the fire pit, stirring the ashes with a stick. 2 days, maybe 3, no more than that, which means they might have been here when we were searching for the stage last night, Brennan said. Right under our noses. The chamber had 2 other passages leading from it, both narrower than the entrance. They explored each in turn. One led to a dead end after 30 feet, blocked by a collapse that might have been natural or deliberate. The other opened into a series of smaller chambers, all empty, before terminating at a vertical shaft that dropped away into darkness. They dropped a stone down the shaft and counted. 7 seconds before they heard it hit something far below. Too deep to explore without proper equipment, and likely just part of the mine workings anyway. They returned to the main chamber and searched it more thoroughly. Among the scattered supplies, they found more evidence of the camp's recent occupants. A shirt with the territorial prison stamp on the collar, a deputy's badge, dented and scratched. A journal, its pages water-damaged, but with enough legible writing to tell them something. Brennan took the journal and carried it out into the sunlight, where he sat on a flat rock and carefully turned the pages. The handwriting was the same as on the note they had found at the stagecoach. Precise and educated, the hand of someone accustomed to putting thoughts on paper. Most of the entries were mundane, recording daily activities and observations, but near the end, the tone changed. The writer, who never identified himself by name, described growing suspicions about his fellow prisoners. He wrote of conversations overheard, of coded messages passed between them, of a plan that seemed to involve more than simple escape. One passage stood out, written in a hand that seemed more hurried than the rest. I understand now what they are. Not common criminals at all, but something far more dangerous. They speak of retribution, of settling accounts, of men in power who will pay for their betrayals. They mention names I recognize from the newspapers: territorial judges, mining company executives, land office officials. These are not thieves and killers seeking freedom. They are assassins seeking targets. The entry ended there, the remaining pages blank. Brennan showed the journal to Whitmore, who read it slowly, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, the marshal looked up at the surrounding hills, as if expecting armed men to appear on the ridges at any moment. This changes things, Whitmore said quietly. If this is true, if these prisoners are part of some kind of conspiracy, then we are dealing with something far beyond a simple escape. The question is whether the guards were in on it, Brennan said. Whether they helped the prisoners escape, or whether they are lying dead somewhere out here. They searched the surrounding area for another 2 hours but found nothing more. No bodies, no weapons, no additional clues about where the prisoners had gone or what they intended to do. The trail, such as it was, had gone cold in the darkness of the mine. They rode back to Mineral Springs as the afternoon shadows lengthened, the journal and the other evidence wrapped carefully and secured in Whitmore's saddlebags. The mood among the posse was grim. They had found answers of a sort, but each answer had spawned a dozen new questions. The town, when they reached it, was waiting for news. People emerged from doorways and gathered in the street as the riders came in. Whitmore addressed them briefly, standing in front of the marshal's office, choosing his words with care. "The stage was ambushed. The prisoners escaped. We found evidence that they camped at Copper Creek, but have since moved on. We will continue the search and have sent word to the territorial authorities. That is all I can say for now." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, people clustering in small groups to discuss what they had heard and speculate about what had not been said. Brennan could see the worry in their faces, the fear that came from knowing there were dangerous men loose in the territory and no clear idea where they might be headed. In the days that followed, that fear spread and deepened. The territorial marshal's office sent a terse reply, acknowledging the situation and promising additional resources, but those resources were slow to materialize. 2 more deputies arrived after a week, bringing with them circulars describing the escaped prisoners and offering rewards for information leading to their capture. The descriptions were detailed, but somehow failed to capture anything useful. Samuel Deacon, age 38, dark hair, scar on left cheek, convicted of armed robbery. Jacob Farris, age 26, red hair, missing 2 fingers on right hand, convicted of horse theft. William Cross, age 42, grey hair, heavy build, convicted of murder. Thomas Lee Pike, age 35, brown hair, spectacles, convicted of fraud. They could have been describing half the men in the territory. The first reported sighting came 3 days after the search at Copper Creek. A rancher 20 miles south of Mineral Springs claimed to have seen 4 men matching the descriptions riding through his property at night. By the time a posse reached the area, any tracks had been obliterated by wind and the passage of the rancher's own cattle. More sightings followed. A merchant in a town 30 miles west swore he had sold supplies to men who fit the descriptions. A prospector, working a claim in the mountains, reported finding a camp that had been recently abandoned. A stage driver claimed to have passed 4 riders on the road to Tucson, all of them armed and moving fast. Each report was investigated. Each led nowhere. The fugitives, if that is what they were, seemed to have dissolved into the vastness of the territory like salt into water. Every lead evaporated under scrutiny. Every witness, when pressed, admitted to uncertainty. Maybe it was them, maybe it was not. In this country, men on horseback were common as dust, and few people looked too closely at faces that might prefer not to be remembered. Brennan spent weeks in the saddle, riding from one reported sighting to another, always arriving too late, or finding the information too vague to act upon. He talked to ranchers and miners, to merchants and drifters, to anyone who might have seen or heard something useful. Most had nothing to offer but speculation and rumor. The frustration grew like a weight on his chest. They were chasing shadows, following whispers, grasping at smoke. The escaped prisoners, whoever they really were, had planned their disappearance with care and were now executing that plan with precision. They were not random fugitives fleeing in panic. They were moving with purpose, staying ahead of pursuit, leaving false trails and dead ends in their wake. The investigation revealed more about the official story, and none of it was reassuring. Inquiries to the territorial prison revealed inconsistencies in the records. The crimes the 4 men had been convicted of were real enough, but the details were murky. Samuel Deacon's armed robbery had involved the theft of documents rather than money. Jacob Farris had stolen horses that belonged to a territorial judge. William Cross's murder victim had been a land office clerk. Thomas Lee Pike's fraud had involved falsified mining claims and forged deeds. A pattern emerged, though Brennan could not quite see its full shape. These were not common criminals. Their victims and their crimes connected to the machinery of territorial government and commerce in ways that suggested motives beyond simple theft or violence. The journal entries proved accurate in at least one respect. These men had targets. The first attack came 6 weeks after the escape. A territorial judge named Harrison Wells was found in his office in Tucson, bound and gagged but otherwise unharmed. His safe had been opened and documents had been taken. Nothing else. No money or valuables, just papers. Wells claimed he had been attacked by two men wearing masks, that they had known exactly what they were looking for, that they had left him alive deliberately after warning him that others would not be so fortunate. The second attack followed 2 weeks later. A mining company executive named Charles Greer was accosted while traveling between towns. Again, documents were taken. Again, the victim was left alive, but with a message. More was coming. Justice was being served. The guilty would answer for their crimes. The territorial authorities escalated their response. More marshals were assigned to the case. Posses were organized in multiple towns. The rewards were increased, but the fugitives remained one step ahead, striking and vanishing like smoke on the wind. In Mineral Springs, life continued with an undercurrent of unease. People went about their business, but with a new wariness, a sense that the familiar order of things had been disrupted. Conversations in the saloon turned often to speculation about the escaped prisoners, about what they wanted and when they might strike again. Marshal Whitmore grew quieter, more withdrawn, the limp in his gait more pronounced. He spent long hours at his desk, poring over reports and circulars, trying to find patterns in the chaos. Brennan often found him there late at night, lamp burning low, papers spread before him like some indecipherable map. "They are not trying to escape," Whitmore said one night, more to himself than to Brennan. "They are trying to accomplish something. Once they finish it, then they will disappear for good." Finish what? That is the question we cannot answer. The months turned. Summer gave way to autumn, the brutal heat retreating before cooler winds that carried the scent of distant storms. The saguaros fruited, and the ocotillos blazed red. The desert transformed in the way it always did, indifferent to human concerns, following rhythms older than memory. The attacks continued, sporadic but purposeful. A land office official robbed of documents, a banker questioned and released. A lawyer who specialized in mining claims beaten and left with broken fingers, unable to work for months. Each incident added another piece to a puzzle that refused to resolve into a coherent picture. The story grew in the telling, as stories always do. In saloons and bunkhouses, around campfires and dinner tables, people spoke of the escaped prisoners as if they were ghosts or demons, capable of appearing anywhere, striking without warning, vanishing without trace. Some claimed they had been seen in 3 places at once. Others swore they had help from Confederates positioned throughout the territory. Still, others insisted they were being protected by powerful men who feared what they knew. The truth, Brennan suspected, was both simpler and more complex. 4 men, organized and determined, moving through a vast landscape where anonymity was easy and authority was thin. They knew the country, knew how to live rough, knew how to avoid the main roads and established towns. They took what they needed and nothing more, leaving behind only fear and questions. Winter came, mild by the standards of other regions, but cold enough in the desert nights. The investigation continued, but with less urgency, the trail having gone so cold that even the most dedicated pursuit seemed futile. The territorial authorities maintained their interest, but from a distance, sending periodic inquiries, but offering little in the way of new resources or direction. Brennan continued his work as deputy, handling the routine matters that made up most of law enforcement in a small town. Disputes over property, complaints about livestock, the occasional drunk who needed a night in the cell to sober up. The escaped prisoners became like a chronic ache, always present, but pushed to the background of daily life. He thought about them often, though. At night, when sleep was slow to come, he would turn the case over in his mind, examining it from every angle, looking for the thing he had missed, the connection he had failed to make. The journal entries haunted him: retribution, settling accounts, men in power who would pay for their betrayals. What betrayals? What accounts? The questions had no answers, only the silence of the desert and the slow turning of the stars overhead. Spring returned, bringing with it the wildflowers that transformed the desert floor into a brief riot of color. The investigation had stalled completely. The attacks had ceased, the last one occurring 4 months earlier. Either the fugitives had completed whatever they had set out to do, or they had gone to ground so deep that even persistent searching could not find them. Marshal Whitmore, his health declining, spoke of retirement. The limp had worsened, and there was a grayness to his complexion that worried Brennan. The old lawman had given most of his life to keeping order in hard country, and the strain of it was written in every line of his face. "Maybe they are gone," Whitmore said one evening, standing on the boardwalk and watching the sun go down. "Maybe they finished what they came to do and rode off into Mexico or California or just disappeared into the wilderness. Maybe we will never know the whole truth of it." Brennan said nothing. He had learned that some questions remained unanswered, some mysteries unsolved. In this country, in this life, a man had to make peace with uncertainty or be driven mad by it. The years passed. Brennan became marshal when Whitmore finally retired, taking the old man's place behind the desk in the adobe office. The town changed slowly, growing in some ways, contracting in others, following the rhythms of boom and bust that characterized mining country. New people arrived, old ones left or died, and the story of the escaped prisoners became part of the town's history, a tale told to newcomers who asked about the wanted posters that still hung faded and dusty on the office wall. Occasionally, someone would report a sighting or claim to have heard something. Brennan would dutifully investigate, but the trail was always cold. The information always second-hand or third-hand, filtered through time and distance until it was impossible to separate fact from imagination. He married a widow named Sarah who ran the town's small school. They built a modest house on the edge of town and talked of children that never came. It was a quiet life, marked by small joys and smaller sorrows, the kind of life that most people lived in most places, unremarkable and therefore precious. But he never stopped thinking about those 4 men and what they had done and why. The journal remained in his desk drawer, its pages yellowed with age, its words still haunting in their implications. Then, 17 years after the stagecoach had vanished on the road to Mineral Springs, something changed. A letter arrived at the marshal's office, addressed to Brennan personally. It had been forwarded from the territorial capital, bearing the seal of the Archives Department. Inside was a brief note from a clerk explaining that during a reorganization of old records, a box of documents related to territorial land transactions from the 1870s had been discovered. Among those documents was a deposition that might be of interest, given his ongoing inquiry into the case of the escaped prisoners. Brennan had made no recent inquiry. The case was so old that he had assumed everyone except himself had forgotten it. But he opened the attached documents with care, spreading them on his desk in the afternoon light that streamed through the office window. The deposition was dated from 1875, a year before the stagecoach had gone missing. It had been given by a man named Martin Hayes, a surveyor who worked for the Territorial Land Office. Hayes described a systematic scheme to defraud property owners and potential settlers through falsified surveys and forged claims. He named names, officials, judges, businessmen, a network of corruption that stretched across the territory. He stated that he had evidence, documents that proved the fraud, and that he feared for his life because of what he knew. The deposition ended with a note from the court clerk. Martin Hayes failed to appear for scheduled testimony. Warrant issued but never served. Current whereabouts unknown. Brennan read the document 3 times, his pulse quickening with each reading. He went to the old files and pulled the records on the escaped prisoners, the descriptions and known associates, the scattered pieces of information that had been gathered during the investigation. There, in the file on Thomas Lee Pike, the man convicted of fraud and embezzlement, he found it. A notation, barely legible, added by some long-ago deputy, also known to use the alias Martin Hayes. The connection clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. The escaped prisoners had not been random criminals. They had been part of something larger, a conspiracy or a cover-up, men who knew too much or had evidence too dangerous to allow them to live. The staged escape, the attacks on officials, the stolen documents, all of it had been about exposing the fraud that Hayes had tried to testify about decades earlier. Brennan sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a heavy coat. If this was true, then everything about the case had been a lie from the beginning. The prisoners had not escaped, they had been released or rescued, or had orchestrated their own liberation as part of a long-delayed quest for justice. And if that was true, then they might still be out there somewhere, old men now if they had survived, carrying their secrets into whatever years remained to them. He looked out the window at the familiar street, the town he had protected for so many years. The afternoon light was soft and golden, painting everything in shades of amber. Somewhere in the vast territory beyond these dusty streets, answers waited. The truth was buried, as the note had said all those years ago, but perhaps not as deeply as everyone had believed. Brennan reached for his hat. The case was not closed. It had never been closed. And now, after 17 years, there was finally a thread to follow, a direction to turn, a possibility that the silence might at last be broken. He would ride out in the morning. The hunt, it seemed, was not yet finished. Part 3. The Truth and the Legacy. The morning Brennan rode out from Mineral Springs, the sky was pale and cloudless, stretched tight as canvas from horizon to horizon. He carried provisions for 2 weeks, though he had no clear sense of how long the journey might take, or where exactly it would lead him. The deposition had given him a name and a thread of connection. But 17 years was a long time for trails to go cold and memories to fade. He rode north first, toward the territorial capital, where the archives were kept, and where Martin Hayes had given his deposition all those years ago. The journey took 3 days through country that had changed more than he expected. Towns that had been raw camps in his younger years now had brick buildings and telegraph lines. Roads that had once been little more than wagon ruts were graded and maintained. The territory was growing up, becoming something more permanent, though the desert itself remained unchanged beneath the veneer of progress. The archives building was a new structure of red sandstone, impressive by territorial standards, with high windows that let in the afternoon light. The clerk who had sent the letter was a small man named Dawson, perhaps 40 years old, with the careful manner of someone who had spent his life among papers and records. "I remember your inquiry from years ago," Dawson said, leading Brennan through rows of filing cabinets and document boxes. "The case stayed with me. 4 prisoners who vanished. It seemed like something out of a dime novel." "It seemed that way to those of us who lived through it too," Brennan replied. Dawson pulled several boxes from the shelves, each labeled with dates from the 1870s. "When we found the Hayes deposition, I thought of your case immediately. The timing was too coincidental. And when I cross-referenced the names," he trailed off, opening the first box and carefully removing a folder. Inside were more documents than Brennan had expected. Survey maps with notations in Hayes's hand, correspondence between land office officials, ledgers showing property transactions that did not match the official records, and photographs, surprisingly, of men in formal poses standing before buildings that bore the seals of territorial authority. "Hayes was thorough," Dawson said. "He documented everything, but he never got to testify. According to the court records, he sent word that he was ill and would appear the following week. Then nothing. The warrant was issued, but the territorial marshals reported back that he could not be located. Eventually, the case was dismissed for lack of a witness." Brennan studied the photographs. The faces were stern and proper, the faces of men accustomed to power and the protections it provided. He recognized some of the names from his investigation years ago. Judge Harrison Wells, who had been attacked and robbed of documents. Charles Greer, the mining executive. others whose names appeared in the list of victims the fugitives had targeted. These men, Brennan said slowly, they were all part of the fraud Hayes wanted to expose. So it would appear. The scheme was extensive. Falsified surveys that moved property boundaries, forged deeds that transferred ownership, settlers who paid for land they never legally received, and the profits were divided among a network of officials who protected each other, and Hayes threatened to expose all of it. Dawson nodded, until he disappeared. I found one more thing, though. It took some searching through unrelated files. He opened another folder and removed a single sheet of paper. A prison transfer request from 1876, 4 inmates being moved from the territorial jail in Tucson to the prison at Yuma. The request was signed by the same judge that Hayes was preparing to testify against. Brennan felt something cold settle in his chest. Judge Wells arranged the transfer and appointed the guards himself, according to the notation here. 2 deputies who had no prior record of prison transport duty. I tried to find out what happened to those guards after the stagecoach incident, but there is no record of them anywhere after that date. They simply disappear from all official documentation. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that was both clearer and more troubling than Brennan had imagined. The 4 prisoners had not escaped. They had been freed, perhaps by the guards themselves, perhaps by Confederates waiting along the route. The entire transport had been staged to look like an escape, providing cover for what was really happening. Martin Hayes and 3 other men who knew about the fraud were being given a chance to disappear before they could testify or reveal what they knew. The other 3 prisoners, Brennan said, do you have their files? Dawson produced them. Samuel Deacon had been a clerk in the land office before his arrest. Jacob Farris had worked as a surveyor's assistant. William Cross had been a deputy recorder. Each of them had been in a position to see the fraud happening, to understand its scope, to gather evidence. They were silenced, Brennan said quietly. Arrested on trumped-up charges, convicted in courts controlled by the same men they could have exposed, and then made to disappear. Except they did not disappear, Dawson pointed out. According to your reports, they spent months attacking the men responsible, stealing back documents, leaving evidence of the fraud where it would eventually be found. They were fighting back. In their way, yes. They could not testify in court, could not trust the legal system, so they took justice into their own hands. Carefully, methodically, exposing the conspiracy piece by piece. Brennan spent 2 more days in the archives, going through every document Dawson could find related to the land fraud case and the 4 prisoners. A pattern emerged more clearly with each piece of evidence. The fraud had been extensive and profitable, enriching dozens of men over the course of several years. But by 1875, it had begun to unravel. Hayes had been preparing his testimony. Others had started asking questions. The men at the center of the conspiracy had moved to protect themselves, using their control of the legal system to remove the threats. But they had underestimated their victims. Hayes and the others had not gone quietly. They had planned, organized, and when the opportunity came, they had acted. The staged escape had been brilliant in its way. It had removed them from official custody without making it obvious that someone in authority had helped them. It had created confusion and divided attention, and it had given them the freedom to continue their work, striking at the conspirators and gathering evidence that might someday set the record straight. What happened to the men they targeted? Brennan asked. Dawson had researched that as well. Most of them left the territory within a few years. Judge Wells resigned his position in 1879 and moved back east. Charles Greer sold his mining interests and disappeared. Several others died under various circumstances, natural causes according to the records, though who can say for certain? By 1885, almost everyone connected to the fraud was gone, dead or departed. The scheme collapsed, though no one was ever officially charged or convicted, And Hayes and the others? No record. They vanished completely. If they survived, they did so under different names in different places. Brennan left the capital with copies of the most important documents secured in his saddlebags, with the care usually reserved for something precious and fragile. In a sense, they were both. This was evidence of crimes committed and justice denied, of men who had fought against a corrupt system in the only way left to them. He rode west, following an instinct more than any concrete lead. The fugitives had moved through the territory for months after their escape, but then the attacks had stopped, the sightings had ended, and silence had fallen. They had either completed what they set out to do, or had recognized that continuing would bring diminishing returns. Where would men like that go? Not back to civilization, where their faces might still be recognized. Not to Mexico, where they would have no connections and no support. Somewhere remote, somewhere they could live quietly, somewhere the long arm of territorial law would never think to reach. He remembered something from the original investigation, a detail so minor he had almost forgotten it. One of the reported sightings had placed the fugitives near the Mogollon Rim, that great escarpment where the high country met the desert. The report had been dismissed at the time as unreliable, but now Brennan wondered. The rim country was remote, thickly forested, cut through with canyons and streams. Small communities existed there, homesteaders and ranchers who valued privacy and asked few questions. A man could disappear into those highlands and live out his years in peace, provided he caused no trouble and kept his past to himself. It took Brennan another week to reach the rim, following roads that grew progressively rougher and less traveled. The landscape changed dramatically as he climbed, the desert giving way to grasslands and then to forests of ponderosa pine that filled the air with their vanilla scent. The temperature dropped with the elevation, and he was grateful for the coat he had brought. The settlements here were small and far apart. He stopped at each one, asking careful questions, showing no photographs or wanted posters, just inquiring about men who might have arrived years ago and settled quietly into the community. Most people were polite but unhelpful. This was country where a man's past was his own business, and neighbors respected that privacy as a matter of principle. At a crossroads trading post, he found something. The proprietor, an ancient man who claimed to have been in the territory since before the war, remembered 4 men who had come through in the late 1870s and bought supplies for mining. They had been polite, paid in gold, and mentioned they were headed up into the high country to work a claim. Did they come back? Brennan asked. Few times over the years. Always bought supplies, always paid fair. Haven't seen them in a long while now. Could be they moved on, could be they died, could be they just stopped needing supplies. Lot of folks up in those hills who keep to themselves. You remember where they were headed? The old man considered. East Fork of Tunta Creek, I think. There's old mining country up there, played out mostly but with enough color left to keep a man interested if he's not too ambitious about it. Brennan bought supplies of his own and headed east, following directions that were more suggestion than certainty. The country grew rougher, the trees thicker, the evidence of human presence increasingly sparse. He passed abandoned cabins and overgrown trails, the remnants of earlier settlement attempts that had failed and been reclaimed by wilderness. On the 10th day after leaving the trading post, he found it. A cabin built from pine logs, weathered but solid, situated in a small clearing beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a garden plot showed signs of recent tending. A single horse grazed in a rail-fenced area near the cabin, and firewood was stacked neatly under an overhang that extended from the roof. Brennan approached slowly, making no attempt at stealth. In country like this, a man who tried to sneak up on a cabin was likely to be met with gunfire. He called out when he was still 50 yards distant. "Hello, the cabin. I am a territorial marshal. I mean no harm, just looking to talk." The door opened after a moment, and a man stepped out. He was old, perhaps in his 70s, with white hair and a full beard. He held no weapon, but his posture suggested readiness. the bearing of someone who knew how to handle trouble if it came. "Marshal," the old man said. His voice was steady, educated, the voice of someone who had once moved in different circles. "That is a long way to ride for a conversation." Brennan dismounted but stayed where he was, hands visible and away from his gun. "I am looking for Martin Hayes, or the man who used to be Martin Hayes, before he disappeared." The old man was silent for a long moment, studying Brennan with eyes that were still sharp despite his age. Finally he nodded slowly. "That name has not been spoken aloud in many years. What makes you think you would find him here?" "Long chain of evidence and good fortune. Mostly the latter, I suspect." "And if you have found him, what then? Arrest? Trial? Prison for an old man who has harmed no one?" "I am not here to arrest anyone," Brennan said. "I am here because I spent 17 years not understanding what happened. And now that I do understand, I thought the man at the center of it deserved to know that someone finally learned the truth." The old man considered this, then gestured toward the cabin. "You had better come inside then. It is a long story, and I am too old to tell it standing up." The interior of the cabin was simple, but comfortable. Books lined one wall, more than Brennan would have expected to find in such a remote place. A table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and a stone fireplace provided warmth against the mountain chill. Everything was neat and ordered, the home of a man who had made peace with solitude. They sat at the table, and the old man, who acknowledged that he was indeed Martin Hayes, poured coffee from a pot that had been warming near the fire. His hands shook slightly with age, but his movements were careful and precise. "How did you find me?" Hayes asked. Brennan explained about the deposition, the archives, the connections he had pieced together. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming details he already knew. "The others?" Brennan asked when he had finished. "Deacon, Farris, Cross?" "Dead," Hayes said simply. "Samuel went first, winter of 1889. His heart gave out. Jacob lasted until 92, got pneumonia and never recovered. William died just 2 years ago. He was cutting firewood, and a tree fell wrong. It was quick, at least." He paused, looking into his coffee as if seeing the faces of his companions there. "We had a good stretch together, though. 20 years up here, living quiet, harming no one. That is more than I expected when we started." "You were never criminals," Brennan said. "Oh, we committed crimes," Hayes replied with a faint smile. "Breaking out of custody, assaulting officials, theft of documents. All of that was real enough, but the charges that put us in custody in the first place, those were fabricated. We were dangerous not because of what we had done, but because of what we knew. The land fraud. Yes, it was vast, Marshal. Hundreds of properties, thousands of acres, money flowing to men who used their positions to steal from people who had nothing. I documented it all, thought I could bring it down through the courts. I was naive. The courts were part of the system, controlled by the same men who were profiting from the fraud. So they arrested you. All 4 of us, on various pretenses. They kept us separated, convicted us in different jurisdictions, made sure we could never testify or present our evidence. And then they arranged the transfer to Yuma, knowing we would never arrive. The guards were going to kill you." Hayes shook his head. "No, I do not think so. I think they were ordered to take us out into the desert and turn us loose, let the wilderness do the work. But the guards were not entirely corrupt, just frightened men following orders they did not fully understand. When we realized what was happening, we convinced them to help us instead. Told them the truth, showed them some of the evidence we had managed to keep hidden. They made a choice. They helped you escape, and then disappeared themselves. They did. Good men in the end. I hope they found peace somewhere." Brennan drank his coffee, letting the warmth of it spread through him. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the pines, painting the forest in shades of gold. The attacks on the officials, the stolen documents, that was you getting justice. "We called it settling accounts," Hayes said. "We knew we could never bring formal charges, never see them tried in court. So we did what we could. Took back the evidence they had stolen from us, left copies where honest people would eventually find them, made their lives uncomfortable enough that most of them chose to leave the territory. It was not perfect justice, but it was something. And then you came here. And then we came here. By 1880, we had done what we could. The fraud scheme had collapsed, most of the men responsible had scattered, and we were tired. We found this place and made our peace with it. Worked a little gold out of the creek, enough to buy supplies. Grew what food we could, read books and played cards and talked about the old days. It was a good life, Marshal. Better than we deserved, perhaps, but good. Brennan reached into his coat and removed the documents he had brought from the archives. He spread them on the table, the deposition and the evidence and the photographs of the men who had orchestrated the fraud. "I want to make this right," Brennan said. "Release these documents officially, clear your names, see that the truth is recorded properly." Hayes looked at the papers for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he shook his head. What would be the point? Everyone involved is dead or gone. The fraud is ancient history. The people who were harmed have long since moved on or died themselves. Opening this up again would accomplish nothing except to disturb graves that are better left undisturbed. You deserve to have your name cleared. I have no name anymore, Marshal. Martin Hayes died in 1876 when he failed to appear for his testimony. The man sitting across from you is just an old prospector who has lived quietly in the mountains for 20 years. That is all I want to be remembered as, if I am remembered at all. What about the others? Deacon, Farris, Cross? Do they not deserve to have their stories told? Hayes smiled, sad, but genuine. Their stories are here, in this place we built together. In the years we had and the peace we found. That is memorial enough. Let the official record show that 4 criminals escaped and were never captured. Let people tell stories about ghosts and legends. The truth can rest here with me, and when I'm gone, it can rest in the ground. Brennan wanted to argue, but something in the old man's face stopped him. There was a finality there, a decision made long ago and reinforced by years of living with its consequences. Hayes had chosen his legacy, and it was not vindication or recognition, but simply the quiet dignity of a life lived on his own terms. They talked as the afternoon faded into evening. Hayes told stories about his companions, about William's terrible jokes and Jacob's skill at cards, and Samuel's habit of reading aloud from books while they worked the claim. He spoke of winters when the snow piled higher than the cabin windows, of summers when the creek ran low and they had to haul water from farther upstream, of small joys and smaller sorrows that made up a life in the wilderness. Brennan stayed the night, sleeping in his bedroll near the fire, while Hayes took the single bed in the corner. In the morning, the old man made breakfast with the efficiency of long practice, and they ate together as the sun rose over the mountains and filled the clearing with light. "What will you do?" Hayes asked as Brennan prepared to leave. "I will file a report that says I followed a lead that went nowhere. The case will remain officially unsolved." "And the documents?" Brennan looked at the papers, still spread on the table where he had left them. After a moment, he gathered them carefully and handed them to Hayes. "These belong to you. Do with them as you see fit." Hayes took them and nodded his thanks. "They will make good kindling this winter." They shook hands at the door, 2 men separated by age and experience, but connected by a story that had wound through both their lives in different ways. Brennan mounted his horse and rode back through the forest, following the trail that would lead him down from the high country and back to the life he had built in Mineral Springs. He did not look back. The years that followed were quiet. Brennan continued his work as marshal, dealing with the routine troubles that came with the job. He grew older, his hair graying, his movements slower, but no less certain. Sarah remained by his side, and they found contentment in the small rituals of daily life. He never spoke to anyone about finding Martin Hayes. The case remained in the files, marked as unsolved, and gradually people stopped asking about it. The story became part of the town's mythology, one tale among many, no more or less significant than any other. Sometimes, though, on quiet evenings when the lights slanted across the mountains in the distance, Brennan would think about that cabin in the high country and the old man who had lived there. He wondered when Hayes had died, for surely he was gone by now. He wondered if anyone had found the cabin, if the books still sat on their shelves, if the garden still grew wild where it had once been tended. He wondered if the truth had died there too, burned as kindling or buried in the earth, lost to time like so much else in this hard country. But perhaps that was how it should be. Not every story needed to be told. Not every truth needed to be recorded. Some things were allowed to rest in silence, known only to those who had lived them and carried to the grave as private history. Years later, long after Brennan himself had retired and passed the marshal's badge to a younger man, a package arrived at the Territorial Archives. It contained documents related to a land fraud case from the 1870s, carefully preserved and annotated. There was no note explaining where they had come from or who had sent them, only the evidence itself, speaking across the years in the careful handwriting of a man who had once tried to expose corruption and paid the price for his honesty. The clerk who received the package filed it properly, noting its contents in the official catalogue. Researchers would eventually find it. Historians would write about the fraud it exposed, and the truth would enter the record in its own time, long after everyone involved had turned to dust. But that was years away, decades even. For now, in the present of Brennan's story, the truth rested where Hayes had left it, neither hidden nor proclaimed, simply existing like the mountains themselves, patient and enduring, and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Brennan died in the spring of 1902, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 64. Sarah found him in the morning, looking for all the world as if he had simply decided to rest and never woke. The town mourned him as towns mourned good men, with genuine sadness and the recognition that something valuable had been lost. Among his effects, Sarah found the old journal from the stagecoach case, still tucked in the bottom drawer of his desk. She read it once, understanding little but sensing the importance it had held for her husband. She kept it, adding it to the small collection of his papers that she donated to the town's historical society years later, when her own health began to fail. And there it rested, another piece of the puzzle, waiting like all the others for someone to come along and fit them together into a complete picture. Whether that would ever happen was impossible to say. The West was full of such mysteries, stories half told and truths partially known, fragments scattered across a vast landscape of memory and time. But perhaps it did not matter. The truth had been served in its way. Justice had been found according to the terms of those who sought it, and 4 men who had been wronged had lived out their years in peace and dignity. That was resolution enough, even if the world never knew the details. The desert remembered nothing and everything. The mountains stood unchanged. The seasons turned, indifferent to human stories, and life continued in the way it always had, beautiful and hard and shot through with moments of grace that made the whole enterprise worthwhile. In the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To live with honor, to seek truth even when the cost was high, to find peace in whatever form it presented itself, and to trust that the scales, in their own time and by their own measure, would balance. The sun set over Arizona territory, painting the sky in colors that had no names, and somewhere in the high country a cabin stood empty among the pines, its story complete, its silence profound, a monument to men who had chosen justice over vengeance and dignity over recognition. And that was legacy enough.